Hey guys, Joyboy here. Got another discussion theory for you today. This time I want to cover the topic of the voice of all things, given what we recently learned about it from Momonosuke. At this point, it is very clear that Momonosuke possesses the voice of all things, and the same is true for Luffy. If you remember from chapter 816, as Momonosuke and group were heading towards the whale tree, Momonosuke complains about a voice that he's hearing, and Kinemon responds with, "Oh, you're just like Odin," and Nekomushi and Inarashi both reply that Momonosuke is similar to another person who said the same thing. Given what we learned in this last chapter, what they're talking about is the voice of all things. They're talking about how Momonosuke can hear a voice that no one else can hear. Odin also possesses the voice of all things, or possessed the voice of all things, and Gold Roger did as well. So given this, it's clear that Momonosuke has heard, at least on two separate occasions, a loud voice. And the second one is clearly Zunisha, but the first one is a little less clear-cut. So the question here is, did Momo hear Zunisha on two separate occasions, back in chapter 816 and this recent chapter 821? Or was he hearing, or is it possible that he was actually hearing the poneglyph back in chapter 816? I think that some people might speculate that he was actually hearing the poneglyph, but I don't believe that to be the case. I think he actually heard Zunisha on two separate occasions. I say this because at the beginning of chapter 821, Momo says, while complaining, that he's hearing this voice again, that being the voice of Zunisha. And so hearing Zunisha's voice again indicates that he heard Zunisha's voice before, and the only other time in the story we're led to or it is indicated that Momo is hearing any sort of voice that no one else can hear is back in chapter 816. So I think that it's basically saying here that Momo, the voice that he was referring to in chapter 816, was also the voice that he hears in chapter 821, which was Zunisha's voice. To further add to this is that whenever Momo was inside the chamber, the poneglyph chamber, he did not react to the poneglyph whatsoever. There's also a clue that Momonosuke might have been hearing Zunisha the entire time that he's been on Zou. There were some chapters earlier in the Zou arc where Momonosuke basically is said that he's been hiding in his room, or just staying in his room this entire time because he's been feeling sick. And there was another panel where he basically reiterated the same thing. And then as he's heading up to the whale tree, he says that it's actually getting worse. He feels worse as he's heading towards the whale tree. And then he talks about hearing a voice, which we now know to be the voice of all things. And when he's hearing Zunisha in chapter 821, he looks in distress. He looks in pain just from hearing Zunisha's voice. That it's possibly just extremely loud, and loud enough to cause him discomfort. So I think the thing that has been making Momo sick since he's been on Zou is the fact that he can hear Zunisha almost constantly. But it's interesting to note that Luffy does not react to whatever it is that Momo is hearing throughout the entire arc, up until the point that Zunisha is actually being attacked by Jack. And so that begs the question of why Luffy didn't react to Zunisha sooner. And I think this might shed some light on the voice of all things and how exactly it works. I think that what this is basically telling us is that there are actually like a power level associated with the voice of all things. You can have the voice of all things to varying degrees. So, which is to say that I think that Momo can hear Zunisha at all points in time. So if Zunisha, for lack of a better term, is just talking to herself, Momo can hear it as a loud voice. And I think that depending on where he's at on the island of Zou, that the voice can actually get louder. But when Jack was attacking Zou, I believe that Zunisha was actually yelling. Rather than just murmuring to herself or doing whatever that she was doing, she was actually yelling. And that is why Momo reacts so strongly to this loud voice. And I also believe this is why that Luffy could finally hear the voice. Because if you look at the reactions of hearing Zunisha's voice between Luffy and Momo, Momo clearly is in agony, while Luffy is not quite so reactive. You could say that maybe Luffy has a higher pain tolerance, but given the fact that Luffy does not show any signs of being able to hear Zunisha at any other point, it really makes me wonder that maybe he couldn't hear it the entire time, and what allowed him to be able to hear Zunisha's voice was the fact that Zunisha was yelling about Jack. So in other words, I believe that Momonosuke's ability to hear the voice of all things is a lot stronger than Luffy's. An interesting side note to this conversation is also potentially revealed back in chapter 816, where Momo reveals that he's hearing some quote-unquote loud voice, which we've now determined to be Zunisha's voice. There's a little ellipses from Law, basically suggesting that Law can also hear Zunisha's voice. Also, given my previous speculation here that Momo has the ability to hear the voice of all things at a stronger level than Luffy, it makes me wonder if Law can hear this and Luffy shows no reaction, that maybe Law also has a stronger ability to hear the voice of all things than Luffy. This of course assumes that Law can actually hear the voice of all things, and by no means do I think that it's fact that he can, but the suggestion here is very strong. Law being able to hear as well might also shed some light on to who exactly has the ability to hear the voice of all things. The characters that we know of that can hear the voice of all things at this point in time are Gold D. Roger, Monkey D. Luffy, perhaps Trafalgar D. Waterlaw, and then we have Momo and Oden Kozuki. And so of all those characters, the only character here that we don't know that is a D is Momo and Oden. But we also know, or there's lots of speculation out there, that the Ds are from the Ancient Kingdom. That's the Ancient Kingdom's descendants are the Ds. And we also know that the Kozukis have been protecting a poneglyph for the Ancient Kingdom, and they also created the poneglyphs themselves for the Ancient Kingdom. So I think this highly suggests that Momonosuke and Oden are also Ds. So adding this into the speculation, the voice of all things might be a trait that is specific to the family of D. But going back to the voice of all things for a moment, it's still really interesting that Luffy and Momo and Oden and Roger have all been revealed to hear the voice of Zunisha when on Zou. However, Roger is the only one who's been known to hear the voice of the poneglyph. Specifically, Luffy and Momo were inside the chamber of the poneglyph, and neither of them showed any reaction to hearing any sort of voice of the poneglyph. And this is really interesting because they clearly have the voice of all things. What I think this means is that hearing the voice of the poneglyph, you have to do something different, or it's a different process than just hearing the voices of random sea creatures. We see from the flashback of the Sea Kings from the Fishman Island arc that as Roger is traveling past the Sea Kings, he's yelling, saying, what are you guys saying? So clearly Roger, like Luffy and Momo, all can hear the creatures just by being near them, hear their voice. But I wonder if to hear the poneglyph, you actually have to touch the poneglyph. Which is to say that in the entire story, Luffy has never once touched the poneglyph. And that's why, although he possesses the ability to hear the voice of all things, he's never actually heard a poneglyph. And the same would apply for Momo. As I've speculated, I think Momo's ability is stronger than Luffy's. He should have definitely heard that poneglyph. However, he also did not touch the poneglyph. So maybe in order to hear the poneglyph, you actually have to make physical contact with it. Bear in mind that the poneglyph is not an animal, it's not a creature, it's just a stone with its voice inscribed on it as text. It very well could be that in order to access the voice to hear it, it requires you to actually touch the characters from the ancient language. At the very least, this would explain why Luffy and Momo did not, or seemingly have not reacted to any poneglyph that we've seen so far. So in summary, here is what I've speculated in this post. Momo has the voice of all things, the same with Luffy. I believe that Momo's ability to hear the voice of all things is stronger than Luffy, and I think that the voice of all things is a trait specific to the lineage of the D's, who are tied to the Ancient Kingdoms, or they're the descendants of the Ancient Kingdom. And I think that the reason why none of the main characters have actually heard the voice of a poneglyph yet is because you actually have to touch a poneglyph to hear its voice. I hope you guys enjoyed.